a lot of people have very good reason to report that their daily life is not something that promises any real marked improvement in the coming weeks, months, years, whatever. So a lot of people are simply reflecting their daily life if they tell you that they got nothing to hope for. I think that's very much a function of a kind of political scene where no one is giving any real reason to expect a better society anytime soon.
The idea of the future has a long history. But in recent decades, some people have said that the future is over, that we don't actually have a future to offer generations that come after us. You had the Sex Pistols famously say in the 1970s, no future. You had Franco Berardi, an Italian thinker, write a book more than a decade ago saying, after the future. People don't see a brighter tomorrow, and that has political implications. So what does it mean when there is not a brighter tomorrow on offer? What happens socially, culturally, economically? How do people's behaviours change? And what kinds of political projects become more appealing? Is a world without a prospective sense of the future, a brighter tomorrow, fertile ground for the left or for the right, for socialism or for barbarism? Talking about all of that with me today is Jonathan White. He's the author of this book, In the Long Run, The Future as a Political Idea. Jonathan White, welcome to Downstream.
Thanks for having me.
Very happy to have you on. It's a bit of a strange one, I think, today, because we're talking about your book, In the Long Run, The Future as a Political Idea. And I think lots of people think, what? The future as a political idea? What's that all about? Like I say, very timely book, very important conversation, huge political implications. But first, where did you get the idea of writing a book about the future as a political idea?
It came out of a course I was teaching at the university, at LSE. And I guess with a lot of my teaching, I like to focus on things that seem to be in crisis in some way or another, concepts that are in question. And I guess in various ways, one picks up on the sense that the future is somehow doubted, met with skepticism, pessimism, and so on in different ways. So, the opinion polls will tell you that people have fears for the prospects of their children and grandchildren, that they will live less prosperous, less secure lives, and so on. Those who study political parties and sort of the politics of policy making will often, again, likewise say that something has shifted and that the way in which politicians talk about the future is perhaps more with an accent on the near term, on the present, on responding to problems as they arise, rather than a kind of more pragmatic outlook on trying to plan and change things for the longer term and so on. So I think in many different walks of life, whether it's kind of the everyday experience of worry and anxiety, or whether it's a more kind of studied understanding of how representatives seem to behave in a contemporary world, one has this sense that the future is, I guess, not what it was. And I think I just thought this could be interesting to pursue further, because at the same time it seems to be very central to modern politics. It seems to be something that almost emerges with modern politics, the future as an idea, as something that one might take as a lodestar for political action to justify what you're doing, to try and mobilize people in support and so on. So I think the future is a central concept in modern politics, and yet in the present it seems to be one that is met with a lot of anxiety. That seemed to me an interesting tension to pursue further, and that's the book came out of that thought.
So the course starts in 2018. When does this realization dawn on you personally? You think, well, actually, this isn't just a vibe amongst a particular subset of the population. There is clearly some sort of a vibe shift here where people are very skeptical, even cynical about the idea of the future. When did you first detect that? I
think some of it clearly comes with thinking about climate change, the sort of paradigmatic expression, I guess, of this. You start to see increasingly a focus on deadlines, a focus on the sort of sense that the present is a critical window where certain things have to be done. No time for mistakes, no time for error. Think of the deadlines that talk about 2030 or indeed 2050. but some notion that there's a sort of an envelope of time in which we have to act. And that already started me thinking that there's something kind of quite distinctive about that. I mean, I think historically, so much of modern politics, I think, had a kind of emphasis on an indefinite future, or sort of the spaciousness of the future, you might say. And climate change is perhaps the obvious example of something that challenges that. Then I guess pair that with everything to do with 2008 and the sense of things that seemed semi-permanent, structures that seemed to be hard to think beyond, suddenly seemed somewhat in question, to do with the economy, to do with the financial architecture of the economy, and so on. And so I think this sort of post-2008 sensibility, amplified by concerns around the climate, got me thinking that we're in something that's quite specific here. It's not quite the world of capitalist realism, perhaps, anymore. It's more a sense of, well, in the book I talk about finality, ultimacy, this sort of sense of living in just before a critical moment where things will either get much, much worse, or possibly with the right kind of action that they might get a bit better. And that seems to me quite a striking phenomenon of the 21st century.
The politics of emergency, which is a big shift from capitalist realism. For people who are listening or watching who aren't aware of that term, obviously Mark Fisher wrote this breakthrough book, 2009, I think, about capitalist realism. It's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, which in a way, I suppose, does go hand in hand with the idea of a politics of emergency, because people are imagining the end of the world. So we're talking about something in the context of climate change, politics of emergency, post-crisis. You have a book, a cup there rather, a mug, a Novara mug, maybe you've not seen it. It says, "No future, utopia now." Now, I sort of, I gather from the book that you think perhaps this might be a quite counterproductive way of thinking about politics, because the basis of democratic politics, liberal democratic politics, is the idea that, well, people can collectively make decisions, and even if those are wrong or aspects of them are wrong, they can be corrected themselves at a later date. But with the politics of emergency, that doesn't work, and that, in a way, undermines the sort of the intellectual possibility of democracy. Is that right?
I think that's right. So modern democracy is representative democracy, and therefore it's a kind of democracy that is all to do with institutions, parties, forms of mediation that basically amount to some people taking decisions on behalf of others. And of course, that's one of the concerns one might have about modern democracy. But because it is that, because it's something that is mediated, there's always the strong possibility that things happen that no individual is particularly happy with, that all of us at any particular moment may feel either public opinion is wrong, or those who claim to speak in the name of public opinion are wrong. And that's kind of almost an unbearable thing, that we're living in a system that seems to be, most of the time, got very objectionable things about it. And as you say, I think one way of kind of coping with that has been to have this notion that whatever's wrong with the present, whether it's about public opinion, whether it's the last election result, can be revisited, can be, at least in principle, corrected in time. So to the extent that there's a next election, to the extent that there is the possibility to persuade people in politics to think and act differently, that there is something to retain some kind of optimism in spite of everything that's wrong with the present. So I think this kind of reliance on the future as a way of coping with the problems of the present is pretty central to modern democracy. I think it's pretty central to a lot of systems, actually. In other words, I think you could say something similar about capitalism, that this is an economic system that has often tried to legitimize itself by exactly relying on jam tomorrow, on the idea that you may not like what your fate is in the present, but there's more to come. You've only seen part of the story. Wealth will trickle down. Even if that doesn't happen, that there is a wider prosperity and indeed peace that will come with a process that, whatever its crises in a particular moment, there's a longer rationality that one can see if one steps back and kind of brings the future into the picture. So in some ways, I guess this is a kind of feature of many human systems, that at a particular moment, they can look quite pathological. They can look like they have rather mad outcomes to it. And one way of trying to assuage that thought, for better or for worse, and sometimes it's kind of propping up perhaps an undesirable system, and some way it's perhaps coping with a flawed system. And I think with representative democracy, it's more the latter. This is a way of making workable what is otherwise a system that's very hard to buy into. But this reliance on the future, on expectations of being able to change everything that is wrong in the near term with a further future, I think that's been a pretty important thought in modern politics and in representative democracy, no less.
Yeah, this idea of grievances in the present will be rectified tomorrow. Obviously, people think about the politics of communism or actually existing socialism in the 20th century, and you wouldn't think that there's parallels there between liberal democracy in the 21st century and the communist projects of the 20th century. But in both cases, there are appeals to, well, there is this greater good, the arc of justice is bending in the right direction, and so you're just going to have to put up with it. I mean, and actually, when you take a step back, it is quite remarkable to think, when we talk about, for instance, in this country, stagnating productivity for the best part of 20 years, flatlining living standards, people say, well, there was the Engels pause in the mid-19th century, and actually people didn't have improving living standards for 40 years. What are you complaining about? And like you say, without that possibility of, well, there is a better tomorrow, then all of a sudden the legitimacy of that system, it starts to collapse. We started this conversation with you saying that the idea of the future is really integral to modernity, modern thinking. So when is that as a thing? When does it inject itself into broader public conversations, this idea of the future?
So I think many historians would try and locate this in the 17th, 18th century especially. So there's a debate, for example, did the ancients have a concept of the future? Or can one really see this as a modern concept? And I think the argument for the latter would be to say, sure, across time, across different societies, there's always been a sense of things to come in terms of individual prospects, family prospects. Think of making wills, for example. I mean, these kind of acts are somehow predicated on the idea of things to come and worrying about things to come and trying to make more secure what is to come. But the idea of the future as something which is kind of different at a social level, the whole of society might be different, as opposed to changing fortunes within a kind of structure that endures. I think that's something that comes a bit later on. Revolutions, I guess, of the 18th century would be an expression of that thought, that over the course of the French Revolution, American Revolution, Haitian Revolution as well, perhaps, that what was originally understood to be stable social structures and that individuals might move within them, but essentially they're here to stay, they become experienced as temporary. And of course, at the same time, you get utopian writers developing that at an imaginative level, projecting ideas of the good society into the future. Talk about in the book the French writer Louis-Sébastien Messier, who has this image of Paris in 2440, so 700 years beyond the time he's writing.
When does he write about this?
He's writing in the 1770s, so just before the French Revolution. He actually later on claims it was a sort of prophecy that begat the French Revolution. He's talking up his contribution here. But he's writing on the eve of the French Revolution, and he's imagining this Paris 700 years into the future. And, of course, what's interesting there is once you start to locate your utopian worlds in the future, you're implicitly saying about present-day society that it's unstable, that it's transient, that you're going to move beyond it at some point. Maybe not in the lifetime of the reader, maybe not in the lifetime of any likely readers beyond the present and future generation, but you're nonetheless suggesting that everything you see around you is impermanent. The contrast being a kind of utopia that sort of discovered island on the other side of the world, and that can live quite happily in parallel with the present. The two are at that level compatible. A utopia in the future undermines the stability of the world of the reader. So I think this, at the level of literary expression, is perhaps paralleling to some degree, foreshadowing what you see at the level of experience in revolution, in everything that then comes with the Industrial Revolution, kind of urbanization, uprooted societies, and so on. You're getting that experience of, to use the terminology of Reinhard Koselleck, this German historian.
Very good, historian that not many people will have heard of, sadly, but yeah.
Very good historian of concepts who emphasizes this kind of emerging dislocation between expectation and experiences. So in the 18th century, he wants to say, whereas people used to kind of expect pretty much how things they had experienced in the past, a sort of continuity from past into the future, what you're starting to see is a kind of mismatch between expectations and experiences, and the thought that maybe what will come is going to be different from the past. And the revolutions of the 18th century, I think, give a kind of tangibility to that thought. You can also, I guess, trace it to changes in religion, I guess, effects of a reformation that maybe suggest that there's more time available, that you're not in the last days, that maybe human society is not about to be interrupted by some kind of divine termination, but you've got time available in which to pursue human projects in this world rather than waiting for a kind of escape into some sort of transcendental order. So you can trace this to the kind of the material experiences of revolution. You can trace it to the imaginative literary works of utopian writers. You can trace it to changes in the Christian world. But one way or another, I think we're probably talking about this kind of increased awareness of an open future, in other words, something that's different from the past and perhaps also makeable. Coming back to utopian thoughts, clearly the idea of Paris in 2440 possibly suggests the idea of a makeable utopia, because it's one that's going to come into being. I mean, it's kind of interesting with utopian thought, because when you put your ideal society 700 years in the future, of course, in one way, you're kind of minimizing the scope for agency, because it seems like it's a long way away. It's 700 years before the better world is going to emerge. And so in some sense, and I think some utopian writers are exactly using this device to sort of encourage readers not to be alarmed about change, to say that real change is still far off. Maybe you're not going to encounter it. You don't have to be worried about, well, for example, slaves getting their freedom is an example I look at in a book. There's a utopian writer, Mary Griffiths, who writes about this theme, but she sets her utopia 300 years hence into the future. And so I think it's, in some ways, there's always this interesting thing about future-oriented utopianism. Is it trying to encourage the reader to think of themselves as an agent and to act and to think about that transience of their society? Or conversely, is it sort of pushing things into the further future and encouraging a kind of almost patient attitude or a deferral of action to future generations? I think it can be read always in both ways, unlike near future utopias, which I guess very much put the accent on what you need to do in the here and now in order to either achieve the better society or avoid the dystopian scenario. These thinkers are bringing in a kind of a scope for agency, even if they are not necessarily themselves making a call to arms. In some ways, perhaps almost doing the opposite, saying, be patient, because change is coming. History is on your side.
This idea of mercy, I mean, he's writing in the 1770s, and you're a historian of ideas. You're looking at, or this book's certainly a history of ideas. You're looking at, what's going to catalyze it and whatnot. And because you're an academic, you're going to hedge your bets. You're not going to say technology. You're not going to say mental conceptions or social institutions or religion or whatever. I'm happy to say I'm a bit of a technological determinist. And it seems pretty interesting that you have this guy writing in the 1770s, the same decade, I believe, as The Wealth of Nations is published, the American Revolution, Watt and Bolton's steam engine is coming online, the beginning of industrial modernity. And at the same time, you have this literary text saying that actually the world isn't permanent. And it seems obvious to me that those two things would go hand in hand. Also, I believe...
Very much so, because, of course, these utopias are heavily about technological change. I mean, their idea of the better future often has exactly the idea of the well-illuminated Paris, the street lamp, the thing that is going to cleanse society by making it by taking away shadows and so on. So this relationship between utopian thinking and technology is already part of the theme, I guess, of utopian writing, as well as what you might say is kind of inspiring it behind its back, that it's kind of giving a kind of energy to the idea of change by confronting people with physical circumstances that are different from what they had in previous decades. But technology is, I think, often the way in which utopian writers are thinking their future. It's the kind of the aid to their imagination.
And I suppose as well, if you're, like you say, you're worried about your audience taking a bit of fright, it's quite useful to say, well, actually, the thing that causes the rupture is the technology rather than a revolution in social relations or people confronting one another in regard to their material interests. On the technology point, quickly, is that book 2440, is that a work of science fiction or speculative fiction? When does science fiction start, Jonathan?
So I think I would put science fiction in a slightly different category insofar as, I mean, clearly there is a lot of definitional work one can do here, but science fiction, I guess, can be about societies which are not an extension of present-day societies. I mean, alien worlds which are entirely detached from anything we're familiar with. I guess there's another interesting distinction with forms of dystopian thought, some of which locate the threats to humanity sort of beyond humanity, whereas others then, and perhaps some of the interesting ones, start to locate it within humanity, so that it may be exactly that modernity or technology is the thing that's going to be bringing the unbearable future in humankind's direction, so that the danger's within as opposed to the meteor or the thing that comes from without. So I would say they become increasingly a theme in the 19th century, but this future-oriented utopian writing is perhaps to be understood as something, a sort of bridge from an earlier utopian genre, in space, Thomas More and everything that comes from that in the 16th century, and then science fiction as more radical still in terms of its detachment from the here and now and the familiar. And of course, then the timescales get really kind of crazy. So sort of Olaf Stapledon or something writing about futures that play out over 1 billion years and multiple iterations of evolution. So you have the first humans, the 10th humans, and so on. These are timescales that probably become possible after Darwinian ideas become available. In other words, once you really have a sense of the spaciousness of the past and how long it took for humanity to emerge, then you start to have the possibility to think in the future on similar scales and to really radicalize it, as in the case of Stapledon. So I would put that a little bit later. I think 700 years is already a lot of time in the 18th century, but billions of years is perhaps a thought that you need to have a few more intellectual developments before you can kind of think on that scale.
I guess evolution, but also extinction. You know, I think this is really underplayed in contemporary debate, is that we didn't really think about certain creatures becoming extinct until the beginning of the 19th century. I mean, Elizabeth Kolbert talks about this in her book about, you know, various great extinctions. And that must have just been like a standing eight count for the intellectuals of the time, the idea that you could just be wiped out. And then you see that feed through, alongside the evolutionary stuff, of course, into ideas of racial inferiority, superiority. Well, we can eliminate the black race, the brown race, the yellow race. If that's what happened to various lesser creatures over time with regards to extinction, why can't it happen to certain races of human? Incredible ideas which are so recent. You know, we're talking about the last 200 years. I want to talk to you about the Italian futurists, who, by the way, again, I love. I can't lie, but maybe they're bad news. Maybe they're bad news. I love Balla in particular. It's Balla, isn't it, with the sculpture? It's not the original sculpture, but the Bon and Tate Modern.
Could well be, I don't know.
Moving in time. Beautiful statue of a seemingly human figure. So this is about Italian futurism, of course, the Futurist Manifesto, written by Marinetti in 1909. It's an artistic movement. For people who don't know, you say, it was also a rejection of the party model of a cumulative political project oriented to progress, guided by long-term ideals. Whereas technocrats and economists sought to rationalize the future and left-wing ideologists looked to it for inspiration, here was an outlook that embraced it as a source of confusion and dislocation. Deliberation was to be subordinate to action and feeling. And of course, that all infuses subsequent fascist politics. But I'll repeat this again. Here was an outlook that embraced it as a source of confusion and dislocation. Deliberation was subordinate to action and feeling. That sounds remarkably like Donald Trump's first few weeks in the White House. So what are the lines of continuity between the futurists in the 1910s and Donald Trump in 2025?
Yes, I entirely agree that the echoes feel very strong at the moment. So first, I guess there's a story to tell of the connection between futurism and fascism in its first iteration, Italian fascism in the 20s into the 30s, and there I think it's fairly clear to show that Mussolini himself says that from this aesthetic futurist movement, they draw an interest in the aesthetics of politics, a sense of a politics which is all about shaking off the constraints of the past, the constraints on action and freedom. Obviously, we often think about fascism as a kind of backward-looking ideology, a kind of restorationist ideology, and clearly that's a current that's present. But I think what is interesting about the kind of the futurist contribution to fascism is exactly this idea of a kind of charismatic politics, which is all about showing yourself to be unbound, not bound by a doctrine. So there's plenty of fascist writing in the 1920s about how fascism is not to be understood as a doctrine on the model of socialism, for example, because any effort to instantiate it is always somehow slightly too slow. It's always about reinterpreting being a fascist in your actions, showing yourself to be a kind of a fascist figure rather than reading it off a script in some way. And this is something that I think clearly comes from futurists like Marinetti and those who are theorizing a kind of perpetual impatience with the present and always self-reinvention. I think then in terms of the echo with the present, I think you very much see this with Trump, with Musk to some extent as well. This it's partly strategic, I guess, which is a kind of instrumentalization of unpredictability, of not entirely making it clear what you're pursuing, what you stand for, not tying yourself to a manifesto, a doctrine, but having this highly unpredictable, personalized style where you make announcements, as with Gaza in the last few days, that seem to come out of nowhere. And even when they've been announced, you try and wonder how seriously does one take this. It makes it very hard for critics, obviously, to find their mark because they're always trying to work out: is this a serious statement? Is this a programmatic intervention, or is this one more piece of self-expression, the kind of politics of surprise, governing by surprise, that the details of which are about to be substituted by the next proclamation. So this personalized, charismatic form of politics, which I sometimes use the word contrarian. I mean, it's all about showing yourself unbound, I think, in Trump's case, showing yourself to be, no one pulls the strings behind his back, no one is going to tell him what to do, and the past itself is not going to constrain him in that respect. What he wants to do, he will do. And that kind of figure of volition, of embodying almost that the person that will do what they want, I think, can be very attractive to a certain kind of voter, because it contrasts so starkly with the way so many other people in politics talk, where it's all about necessity and doing what you have to do because there's an emergency, because there is a kind of technocratic reason or a economic reason that requires us to do whatever, austerity policies or various kinds of pandemic response that are in the name of healthcare, science, and so on. This kind of politics of volition, which you see with Trump and this kind of contemporary instantiation these far right ideas, I think is partly resonant because it's so different from other ways of doing politics that we've become much more familiar with in the last few decades. So I think there's a story of continuity with fascism and futurism of the 20th century, and there's also a sense in which it stands out more in the present because of the ways other people are doing politics in the present. The way the left is perhaps not doing a kind of a politics of promising change, of promising programmatic departures from the present, but is much more kind of evacuating that territory of the future to people like Trump and Musk to draw to themselves.
So for people watching or listening to this, they might think, Aaron, my God, you're comparing Trump to fascism. And even if you don't think that, I think what's clear is that the style of politics, which people like Marinetti, Mussolini talk about, clearly there's a continuity between that style of politics, how you captivate the wider public audience, how you conduct yourself, how policy really is an appendage to public relations rather than the other way around. Clearly, that's infusing how Trump does politics. Clearly, that's infusing how national populists in the 21st century doing politics. And that formulation you had just a moment ago, how they won't be constrained by the past, is so powerful because I think that's spot on. And the way that Trump relates to the past is fascinating because it isn't just the past which he disagrees with, the past from the left. He also very rarely uses right-wing figures as cultural political touchstones. He very rarely says something about Reagan, whereas American Republicans, my entire life would say, well, I'm a low-tax Reagan conservative. He never says that. He's like, I'm Donald Trump. I'm not going to be, as you put it, constrained by the past. And I remember...
Which is also, of course, to be constrained by, moral norms or legal norms.
Exactly.
I mean, there's so many ways in which if you kind of acknowledge the authority of the past, you're kind of binding yourself at some level, and of course, in many ways, desirably so. But for the person that wants to really throw that all off and cut a figure of kind of unbound self-expression, then of course they are taking aim not just at tradition and, as you say, the kind of the forefathers of their intellectual tradition to the extent that I even identify with one, but it's morality itself, it's legal norms, all these things that have to be experienced as inherited if they are going to have any real purchase upon you. And if you don't want to acknowledge your place in relation to the past, then morality, law, it also becomes kind of evaporates with that.
So you're obviously a political theorist as well. So if we're looking at a spectrum of ideological thought, far left to far right, I mean, I don't think many sensible people think it works like that anymore. But what you're saying is fascism as a style of politics actually is quite antithetical, not to necessarily right-wing politics, but to classical conservative politics, which takes very seriously the idea of the past, conventions, norms, our inheritance. And fascism, or the style of fascism, has nothing to do with that. So, I mean, is that fair? Because that's something I've seen personally. I'll see conservative journalists, somebody like Peter Hitchens, will say, it's outrageous that you people are supporting Trump. Look what happened on January 6th. How could a conservative ever support that kind of carry on? How could it support lawlessness? So where does fascism then fit in that broader ideological spectrum?
I would agree that many conservatives would exactly take distance from that. I think you get amalgams in politics where there may be reasons for these to draw together, and there are, I guess, even in the early 20th century, there are currents of thought that bring together a kind of conservative concern about property relations, about existing economic structures, with this more kind of unpredictable fascist sensibility. So these things can find alliance, but I think at the level of pure ideas, for me, fascism is something which is much more disruptive, to use a term of the moment, and unwilling to put itself at the kind of the top of a tradition of something that unfolds over time. I mean, here you've got a clear contrast, I think, not just with the left, with socialism, but also with liberalism, with everything that comes out of the 19th century, which is exactly about a cumulative project, something that unfolds over time. You might say, well, but socialists, they've been revolutionary, they've been surely also about breaks, ruptures, departures from the past. And of course, but I think the socialist break with the past, socialist left-wing revolutionary thought is always about casting off something specific, something like a particular economic model, moving on to a next stage of socioeconomic development. It's about taking distance from something, often in the name of a deeper continuity of human welfare or of social progress across time, and of course for that reason has a willingness to use organs such as political parties defined by ideas, by some type of set of commitments that are meant to last, because it's understood as a kind of cross-generational project, you might say. This is, I think, very different from everything that we're saying about fascism, where it's not about coherence across time, about consistency of program. That's, of course, not to deny that there are material interests that may prosper with fascism, and it may be even designed to advance. But in the way it presents itself politically and its relationship to the public sphere, I think it's a very different self-presentation, and it's that makes it obviously quite apposite for crisis times, for a time of upheaval when it's hard to be consistent, to be coherent, to have a kind of an ideological program that you try to pursue over the coming years, over the coming decades. It's a lot easier to throw it all up in the air, to make whatever promise to your supporters comes to mind that particular week. It's much easier to have this type of pointillistic, I guess, relationship to time, always saying something new that confounds what you said yesterday, or that doesn't have a logical relation to what you said yesterday. It's a lot harder to, like the left has traditionally done, pursue norms of coherence, consistency of the cumulative progressive project.
So politics of emergency necessarily favours fascist politics, or a fascist style of politics?
I think it's fertile ground for it. It's fertile ground for it, certainly.
So us all saying we've only got 10 years left, actually, if you're a progressive or you believe in liberal democratic norms, politics, etc., you may be shooting yourself in the foot.
There is that risk, but I think at the same time, one has to think, well, where does this come from? Why is there that temptation to scale all problems up to problems of emergencies, of things that cannot wait? And it seems to me, I mean, it's partly simply that we live in volatile times, but I think more than that, it is that we live in times in which there's a kind of generalized sense of powerlessness, in which things present themselves as emergencies because people doubt their capacity to control them. So if you take climate change, for example, climate change is not an emergency in the sense that we don't know what to do, that we lack points of orientation in terms of climate science, but it's an emergency in the sense that it's not clear where the agency to deal with it comes from, and to the extent that states, political parties, those organs that one might look to act on such questions seem to be offering so little in this regard. So, and you could say the same, I think, for economic inequality, concentrations of economic wealth and so on. These things become emergencies to those who feel powerless before them. And so while, yes, I think that sensibility can be quite a dangerous one, because it can encourage this emphasis on kind of heroic action, heroic interventions that try to resolve things in the here and now in a very kind of fast sense. It's not a... I think we have to understand where it comes from. It comes from a sense of powerlessness that I don't think you will resolve without trying to strengthen organs of political agency, which things like states and parties and unions, every form of collective organization that we've kind of come to know over the modern period, the kind of things that promised some capacity to control the problems we encounter, and yet which seem so weak in the present. So yeah, I think the emergency outlook may not be particularly useful to the left, but I think it is also at the same time a kind of expression of the predicament of the left.
Yeah, I can hear someone almost shouting at their phone or their laptop saying, but it is an emergency. Sorry, I think this is the warmest January in recorded history. Is one of the problems that there is a disconnect between our access to information, quantifiable data, and our agency? You know, this really hit me with COVID. We were having daily real-time updates of the number of cases and people dying from a pathogen, which has never happened before. You certainly didn't get that with the Spanish flu after the First World War. And obviously, we've had multiple emergencies throughout history. You know, this is one thing that really annoys me, actually. We can talk about this more. There was this idea of the birth strike. I'm not going to have any children. People are welcome to not have children, your choice. I'm not going to have any children because of the climate situation. And you're welcome to do that. But that rests upon the assumption that we haven't, as a species, endured really profoundly horrific things before. You could talk about the Black Death. 40% of Europeans are killed. 40% of Europeans are killed. Or you can go back to the Bronze Age collapse. You know, it got so bad that Greeks forgot to write for 400 years. That's how bad the collapse was. And it's probably unlikely we're going to go through a collapse that bad. I mean, who knows? So this idea of a politics of emergency, which of course we had in the 30s, we've had many times, but it's very intense now. Is there a sense of disproportionate emergency because there is such an access to quantifiable data? You know, when we had the cooling, which basically arguably ends the Roman Empire, you didn't have statisticians talking about, well, actually this summer is colder than last summer and crop yields are falling in Dalmatia, etc. Is that one of the problems for productive political action now, that we have too much data?
So I think one thing that is characteristic of this emergency outlook that we've been talking about is that it pairs with an overwhelming amount of data and encourages the desire to sort of track problems in terms of the things you can measure in real time. So obviously, decarbonization goals might be part of that, but also economic measures of how the economy is doing and so on. These are things which you can track in real time and that often become guides to whether our policy interventions are working or failing. And I think, to come back to your earlier remark, I think that does feed into this sort of emergency sensibility, because when the metrics are not good, when they seem to be failing us, then of course you know about it immediately, and that sense of kind of riding out the resilience that sometimes comes with not paying attention to the latest piece of data, but thinking about the principles in play, the things that kind of give kind of normative motivation rather than just empirical guides to how successful our policy interventions have been. This is something that I think can create a certain fragility to policy interventions. Maybe another word on the idea of emergencies. I mean, I certainly wouldn't want to be read as saying that there's a kind of too much urgency in politics and that we should all kind of chill out a little bit and just sort of relax. It's not that the sense of urgency in politics is misplaced. I think maybe another aspect of an emergency is the idea that it's just a temporary thing. The emergency as something that ultimately you'll get out of. You'll be on the other side, that there's a kind of normality to come. So an emergency, on the one hand, is kind of break with the normality that was, but it also promises this idea of there'll be some kind of calmer time if you can just get through the worst, if you can get through a transition, to use another keyword at the present.
What are we talking about here, though? Is that libs, or would you say that's actually everybody in politics? Because that was the whole Brexit thing, right? If we just stop this one emergency, we can go back to pre-2016. Or are you talking about something much broader?
I think it's pronounced in the liberal centre, but I think when we hear talk of a green transition also on the left, I think the notion of transition has this kind of promise of a new equilibrium that's going to arrive at some point once we get to the other side. And this is picked up then, I think, well beyond liberals. And I think it can be misplaced. In other words, the idea of a kind of equilibrium to come, a normality to come, I think is quite misleading. Even if you make progress in politics, even if you successfully decarbonize the economy, if you change economic sources and so on, everything that itself seems increasingly optimistic as a scenario. But even if you achieve all that, these things they're going to be backlashes. They're going to be efforts to undo them. There are going to be new problems that emerge in their wake, or things that become more become new priorities that have to be engaged with in that supposed new equilibrium to come. So things never settle down, it seems to me. And the danger of thinking in these kind of transitional concepts, and I think emergency is on a similar kind of structure, that you think of now it's pretty shit, but if we can do what it has to be done, we can get to the other side. I think this is implausible. I think it also can be a problem for democratic institutions, because it cultivates a kind of instrumentalist, let's do what we need to do by whatever means necessary. If the technocrats are the best ones to put in charge of climate policy, for example, and we can cut out public opinion, then fine, then we can get to that other equilibrium a little bit faster than if we have to try and do all this through public opinion. And as I say, I think that's a misleading way of thinking about the future, and it encourages ways of doing politics which are transitional, which are temporary, as opposed to longer-term forms of organisation which are indefinite in their horizon.
So this idea of equilibrium, this is really interesting. So what you're saying is that basically in the centre, until maybe quite recently, but some still believe this, is that we just need to get to the other side and there'll be some kind of economic equilibrium, that the post-2008 economic model is just, it's momentary in terms of its decline, things will pick up, or like you say, constraints today, jam tomorrow, austerity today, abundance tomorrow. That's very much people who believe in status quo politics. What you seem to be saying to me is that the left mirrors that exact same temporality mindset when it comes to things like the green transition. Just do the hard stuff today, and then we're going to have this, homeostatic environment, which, by the way, it never has been and never will be, on the other side of a climate transition. So you're basically saying, actually, as much as the left likes to criticise that aspect of centrist liberal thinking, they're replicating it.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of baggage that comes with the idea of transition. And insofar as some people try to rethink a green transition beyond simply the kind of the minimalist liberal interpretation of it in terms of switching energy sources, but try to bring more into that to do with societal transformation, to do with responding to justice and just transition as opposed to simply an energy transition. On the one hand, they are, I think, entirely appropriately opening up to a much wider set of concerns, but to the extent to which they still adopt that structure of thinking about the future in terms of a transition, I think it's slightly self-defeating. And maybe, as I say, because it feeds into ways of doing politics which are about institutions which are transitional. So particular forms of social movement mobilization, but also, as I say, forms of institutional intervention from technocratic institutions as well. And I think one of the desirable things about older forms of left party political organization was exactly they were premised on the indefinite future, that the party is a kind of thing that's meant to last. It's meant to be longer than the lifetimes of the people that join it. It's a kind of continuing institution that outlives those who happen to be contributing to it at a particular moment. That's a way of organizing around a kind of indefinite cause, one that you certainly hope to make progress along the way, but you're kind of organizing on the assumption that it's never going to be appropriate to take your guard down and to assume that you've kind of reached a new point of stability on the other side. I think that's something we need to recapture, because I think a lot is lost if one buys into this notion of the temporary hardship, the temporary ordeal, the kind of one last heave model of organising in the face of emergencies.
I'll get back to that in a moment, but some of the language you used a moment ago, you said quite misleading. Now, for people who are watching, listening, who aren't necessarily acquainted with the particularities of the English language, that's very British understatement. For most Americans out there, quite misleading means it's complete nonsense. They're a mile off the mark. So, and I think this is really important, we could completely decarbonize our energy systems. We could have, a massive reduction in terms of emissions of CO2 globally. We could start to reduce them. We could do all these things. And it may still be that we lose the Gulf Stream and that Britain's climate in 100 years is colder than Iceland's today. That may happen. And as a society, as a species, we're going to have to adapt to these things, as, by the way, our ancestors did in the deep past. And I think you're right to say that as a political proposition, it is misleading. And it is implausible. And I think you need to be open with people about that. And in a weird way, the right-wing criticism of this stuff, well, the climate's always changed. And we had ice ages, it's kind of true. It's kind of true. I
think just on another
Please.
point on transition, I think, and maybe here thinking about it for those who use it from the centre or the right, I think another thing that maybe explains why it's had some popularity is because it promises temporary interventions, which makes them more palatable to those who wouldn't want them to be permanent. So I'm thinking, for example, of state interventions to reduce the cost of renewables, for example, subsidies and so on. Clearly, these are things that those beholden to a market model of the economy may be quite uncomfortable with. And for that kind of constituency, the role that the concept of transition perhaps is playing is to say, don't worry, it's just a temporary way of doing things. We'll be able to discontinue this on the other side. By analogy, think of the 1990s. Think of the transition framework as a way of talking about post-communist change in Central Eastern Europe. And again, I think there would have been market liberals quite unhappy with the idea that you had to make markets in Central Eastern Europe by state-led policy. And of course, that's how it was. It was an institutional program, not just kind of letting the market loose and letting it emerge by itself. Or likewise, transition discourse comes up in talk around democratization in the 80s and indeed the 90s, and the need to create and consolidate democratic orders. And again, it's the same pattern, I think, that many people who are Democrats might be uncomfortable with the idea that you have to make democracy by undemocratic means, that you have to bring it into being from above by institutional interventions, sometimes with the help of international institutions rather than organically. And the role that the notion of transition, it seems to me, plays there is to say, sure, there's a few unpalatable things that have to be done in order to create a liberal market economy, a liberal democracy, and so on, but these are temporary interventions, and once they are set up, they are self-maintaining systems. I think that's, as I say, something that you see mirrored in the appeal of the transition framework for thinking about climate change. Maybe not its appeal on the left, but its appeal for some on the right, I think, is that it makes rather unwelcome interventions that otherwise would seem completely out of place for those who have commitments to do with how the economy itself deals with all these problems without organised intervention from the state. Call it a transition, and it sounds like it's just a short-term aberration. That makes it somehow more palatable, I think.
You write that the individualization of the future pairs with the closing of the future. Explain that.
Yeah, so that's a phrase that comes up in the book where I'm talking about neoliberalism, the capitalism of the latter 20th century, and the ways in which, for a whole number of reasons, you could talk about a kind of almost privatization of the future, so that people become perhaps, on the one hand, more precarious in their employment conditions, becomes harder to plan at an individual level, but also harder to think in terms of collective bargaining, trade union membership, and so on, when you don't know whether you're going to have a job in a few months' time, in a few years' time. And of course, other changes of the economy of the latter 20th century, debt and so on, things that, again, I think serve to detach people from a wider sense of shared predicament. Debt, credit ratings, these things are all about putting a number on individuals and sort of taking them out of the class experience and making their problems or experienced as such. So whether it's to do with changes in employment relations, changes in people's relationship to debt and reliance on debt. I think what you're seeing in the latter 20th century are various changes that separate people from each other and that make it harder to think of shared futures and to organize collectively for the sake of them for that reason.
But what does that have to do with the future? So I find this a really interesting idea, but I'm trying to work out, actually, because it instinctively feels correct, but I'm trying to work out what it means. So there's obviously an individualization, social atomization of experience. Completely get that. Even now, to the extent that in the 2020s, we have hyper-individualized news feeds, right? With AIs recommending what we should think and feel. Totally buy that. But this idea of an individualization of the future. So I can imagine what that means is that in the mid-20th century, there are these big arch meta-narratives about the future, communism, fascism, nationalism, etc. Progress, social democratic modernity. And we're all going to march that bright future together. That's replaced by something else. But what is that something else?
So consumerism might be another element to bring in here. So the dream of the better future as a story of personal betterment. So goods that are marketed as ways to live the better life. Cars marketed as things that are your dream of what you want to aspire to, that are not just about material wealth, but joining a kind of moving up in class terms, being part of achieving at the level of personal prospects. I think so much of the rise of post-war consumerism in the latter 20th century is about marketing to people kind of personal dreams of betterment rather than collective dreams of improving society as a whole or improving the conditions of a particular class relative to another class, state versus other states, and so on. So on the one hand, it's what I was talking about before, about the weakening of what you might call the places in which people can collectively think about the future together. So a stable employment setting, the factory, I guess, historically, might be the place in which it becomes possible to think about a class, to think about, in experiential terms, what it might mean to better your conditions as a group rather than simply as an individual. On the one hand, you have the waning of this sort of everyday experience of sharing problems with others who are in an analogous situation to you. And on the other hand, an emerging kind of commercialized public sphere, which is telling you your dream for the future is about you, or it's about your family. It kind of shows you a picture of the family by the flashy car and says, this is what you aspire to, isn't it? That is, as I say, a kind of individualization or privatization of the future, which creates a kind of compelling competitor to the idea of either the progress of society or the progress of groups within society and the kind of rectification of the hardships they suffer.
But I guess that's died in a way, right? You talk about the car, for instance. There was that hypothesis, wasn't there, about 15 years ago, that for millennials, the technology of autonomy and independence was no longer the car, but the smartphone. And I think that I think most people think this, that actually this is not an emancipatory technology in the slightest. And in terms of an individualized future, for instance, consisting of the family with your SUV going to your out of town, retail park, I have friends. I'm partly like that. I have friends that live that experience. That's partly my experience. Not many of them like it. They enjoy it. They like going to the nice M&S and the kids get to play and have a nice cheap meal or whatever. But I don't think it satisfies something within them, and I don't think many people view that as progress. I mean, and that's why I think as a country, I can speak about the UK. I think most people recognise the fact we're going backwards. Right, the country's in decline now. People on the right say it's for some reasons, people on the left say it's for others. But I think that's a consensus.
Yeah.
So that individualization of the future, has that itself also suffered some kind of a setback? And
well, I think you're quite right to say that for many people it's not enough, and there's a kind of a sense of that's a meaningless set of aspirations to hold. And I think I think politicians often mistakenly assume that this type of mentality is what their voters consist of, and that if you can keep them happy as consumers, then That's basically it. And they don't need anything more than that. They don't have any kind of more search for a sort of political meaning or being part of some type of project of social change rather than simply personal betterment. I think that's a misreading that is common amongst those who try to represent citizens they don't really understand. I think there is great dissatisfaction with it, but at the same time, it's not gone. I mean, you mentioned algorithms and the ways in which these also are kind of giving us personalized ideas of what we like. It's no longer perhaps the advertising person trying to sell us the car as though it's going to turn us into happy people. Maybe we've slightly outgrown that thought, but the way in which we receive personalized news feeds and the way in which we kind of expose ourselves to information sources which are somehow a function of prior revelations of our preferences as we have clicked on this and that and so on. This, I think, is perhaps a kind of algorithmic updating of this individualization insofar as we are exposed to ideas and images of aspiration which are somehow designed to us in our specificity. That's to the extent they work, they're meant to be about what we want as individuals rather than about what we as kind of members of a collective of some kind or another are hoping for. So yeah, there's dissatisfaction. There's, I think, an appetite for breaking out of this model, but I think at a kind of banal level, we're still very much in it.
Yeah, I went to Chichester for the last general election, which I think went Lib Dem. It was a Tory seat. It had basically been a Tory seat, a Conservative seat, since the 1830s. But if you go further back, basically it had been a Conservative seat, I think, for the entirety of its history, with the exception of one election where it went Liberal. And this is a constituency, obviously we've not had universal suffrage or any kind of suffrage all the way back to the 14th century, but it had been a constituency since the 14th century. So very old place, obviously, cathedral there and whatnot. And I'm going through Chichester, and this is really remarkable, Jonathan. I remember meeting an old boy, barber coat, ex-military, perfectly affable chap, saying the country's screwed. Everything's buggered, right? I then go see a young guy, early 20s, country, buggered, quite racist. I then see a young, and maybe people remember the clip of this, I then see a young kid, mixed heritage, looks half black, as in, you know, I presume his parents are mixed, and one of them probably was also born here, maybe West Indian heritage. I don't know, that's just my guess. He's also saying quite racist things about migrants, and he's also black-pilled. I then meet somebody else who's very left-wing, and they're saying the country's screwed. And it really was a bit of a revelation to me, because we're in the southeast of England here, the part that's actually doing pretty well compared to the rest of the country. And one of those people even referred to Chichester as hell. And I'm thinking, well, there's Chinese and Japanese tourists here. They don't think they've come to hell. They think they've come to a nice, quaint cathedral town. By the way, very nice cathedral. Is this kind of response, this kind of zeitgeist, and I know not everybody thinks like that, but clearly there's more people thinking like that than there were 20, 30 years ago. Is that a response to is this just the logical outcome for a post-ideological society? Where you have a society with no ideology, people either get bored or angry or indifferent or apathetic.
A lot of people have very good reason to report that their daily life is not something that promises any real marked improvement in the coming weeks, months, years, whatever. So a lot of people are simply reflecting their daily life if they tell you that they got nothing to hope for. I think what's interesting, though, about your anecdote is that these are people who are perhaps not just the ones who are suffering obviously crap conditions, but they are also perhaps living in a fairly pleasant, affluent corner of England and doing quite well for themselves, and yet also have this instinct to say that the country, my life, whatever, is rapidly deteriorating. And yeah, I think that's very much a function of a kind of political scene where no one is giving any real reason to expect a better society anytime soon. So parties tend to define themselves more as managers in terms of competence, in terms of staving off the worst. but they don't tend to define themselves in terms of here's how we could really change the city, or here's how we could really think about a different way of doing the economy or organizing the place of workers and their capacity to shape the decision making of a company, of the wider economic environment. This is not the language of politics, of course, anymore. It's about we're a safe pair of hands. And of course, that type of justification for policy and that self-presentation of representatives is very thin. It's very weak. It doesn't give you anything to work with. And I think to the extent that maybe the good citizens of Chichester might have given you a different response in the past, maybe because to the extent you can identify with a cause, with some type of collective action that stretches into the future, you've got something to hope for. You may not expect that things are going to turn around in any time soon. I think that's never been the promise of collective forms of politics, that you're going to have short-term progress, but at least you have something that seems to carry on the good fight beyond the here and now, beyond even your own lifespan, or beyond your time in working life, when you retire, when you have children, and so on. If no one is making that kind of argument, then what reason do you have to express any optimism about the future? So I think, it's the generalization of that gloomy outlook which is the interesting aspect of the present, beyond those people who've always had good reason to take that perspective.
That was what really hit me, is, people since 2016 in British politics, we've talked about left behind towns, we've talked about deindustrialization. These were the winners. These are meant to be the winners of our economic system, and they were as black-pilled as anybody else.
I guess there's also, to connect back to what we were saying about individualization and so on, I guess there can be this kind of promise of collective experience that comes with catastrophe or breakdown, or with things going badly, that at least it can feel like a collective experience. So, in the Brexit period, those who were saying, well, Brexit is going to be the ruin of Britain, at least it felt like, well, we're all going through this together. It's a kind of generalized disaster that we all have to collectively muddle through in some fashion. I think you had this kind of discourse in Liberal Remain quite frequently, and this sort of appeal to the country is getting shit, but at least that's something that we can collectively experience, is, if you like, a kind of repudiation of that individualization that we were just talking about, a desire to find some sort of shared experience, even if it's a bad one. I think is kind of it makes sense if the alternative possibility is that my problems are really simply my problems and they're not shared, and my debt predicament is something that looks quite different from the next person down. It's got my particular number on it. That's I think in some ways almost worse. So you perhaps could detect a note of backhanded optimism amongst those who are saying things are getting awful, but they're getting awful for the country, or they're getting awful for this city, or they're getting awful for everyone I know. It's a way of saying we still share something. We still share something in our decline.
That's really interesting. I remember talking to John Gray, actually, and he said on this podcast, video show, he said that in some ways people today have it worse than people living under feudalism, because the thing that you're talking about, suffering today for a better tomorrow, that's disintegrated, by the way. That was the kind of bet of the 90s and the noughties, wasn't it? Even if your life isn't great, your children will have better lives, their grandchildren will have better lives, which is broadly true for 50, 60, 70 years. That's disintegrated. And he said, at least, so that's gone, but at least with feudalism, pre-capitalism, you had people saying, well, my life's crap, but at least there's a heaven. There's something bigger. There's something after this. And actually, we live in this extraordinary political, social moment. And I know people love to think they live in unique circumstances, but actually I think in this particular regard, we do, which is that we expect people to have crap lives, and that's it, right?
Yeah.
And actually, this is a unique challenge for a secular society. When you have religion, at least people are the opium of the masses, the belief in an afterlife. And that was the particular formulation, opium of the masses. That's what Marx meant But I think there's something to that, right? And spiritually, psychologically, I mean, that does seem incredibly damaging, and we don't take that very seriously. Politicians think, well, people have always been like that. Actually, no. Across all societies over tens of thousands of years, or 10,000 plus years, there's been no societies like that.
Yeah, I think the religious connection is very interesting, and I guess the other way of reading what you're saying would be perhaps we should expect exactly the return of religion, or efforts to revive this kind of consolatory role of religion, to the extent that people struggle to identify the better future in the world and made by people collectively. Maybe you start to see a kind of return to that seeking for solace in some kind of otherworldly future. I think you already see elements of that in both Christian and Islamic worlds, the sort of use of a religious consolation as a way of coping with not just material hardship, but the loss of the promise of amelioration, if not for me, then for descendants and so on, or contributing to a wider project of amelioration. And of course, the historians would say that was kind of the precondition of the idea of the future back in the 18th century. It was that there had to be a kind of weakening of that attachment to the otherworldly future, to simply a focus on the future of the soul, or the expectation of divine judgment and the kind of an end of this human world. Insofar as that is the organizing expectation of what's to come, then why would you try and do much to change the structures of society? Try and do what you can to protect your soul, I guess, or to protect the souls of others. But I think there's a link of that kind of in the beginning of modernity with the weakening of religion and the bringing of the future into the world, if you like. And conversely, what you might see today is a sort of reversal of that, and the weakening of that set of aspirations for the future as something makeable by people in the world, being substituted by some kind of attempt to revive religion. I can imagine it'll be promoted in these terms. Whether it'll be successfully promoted, we have to see. But the religion will be exactly promoted as the way of finding solace when nothing in the world seems to offer it. Seems entirely plausible to me.
Which is why Christianity takes off. Christianity 1.0 takes off in the Roman Empire, because you have multiple plagues, you have economic turmoil, you have climate change, and all of a sudden the old pagan religion doesn't seem so alluring, and actually a nice afterlife sounds pretty good. So there's some parallels there. Have you read a book called The Religious Shall Inherit the Earth? Oh. Very interesting. So if you look at, for instance, fertility rates in the United States, they're obviously very high for religious fundamentalists. And even people of a liberal religious bent, they're obviously in decline. And the hypothesis is that, if things carry on like this for the next 200, 300 years, obviously that could be quite a stupid way to proceed, but let's just go with that, then actually religion is just going to become a much more central part of politics and society. And you already see that with Israel, right? So I think in 1947, 1% of the country was Haredim. I think by 2050, it's going to be about 35%. So purely as a function of higher birth rates than the country writ large, it's going to become a more religious society. And I wonder, this kind of the interface of our economic model is bust. We've got this complete vacuum where we have visions of the future, and we have falling fertility rates among secular-minded people and high fertility rates for religiously-minded people. Kind of seems inevitable that faith will supplant the idea of a better collective future.
It's entirely possible to imagine that. It wouldn't require, as you're saying, anyone to suddenly convert to religion. In other words, it could simply be a kind of replacement over time of those who are more secular by those who brought up to be religious. And of course, there's arguments that say that we need this, and that if we're going to deal with climate change, that we need some kind of new religion. Maybe it's not about the religions of the past, but I guess the Ministry of the Future, Kim Stanley Robinson's book, has elements of this in it, about characters talking about the need for exactly creating a kind of a religion for an instrumental reason of giving people some kind of motivation to think about concerns beyond themselves, to think about the future of humanity, of the world, and so on. So,
do you agree with that?
No, I don't agree with that. I think too much comes with religion that is distracting from political purposes. I don't think that religion is cannot be harnessed to progressive causes. So
let me rephrase that. Sorry, not necessarily religion, but a form of spiritualism. So, for instance, there might be an argument that actually key to advancing climate goals is a reconfigured relationship between humans and animals and humans and quote unquote nature, which could be spiritual. It doesn't need to be a formalized religious orthodoxy. What would you say to that?
If it gets people away from approaching climate change simply in terms of measurable targets and so on, then I think it'll bring far more motivational capacity with it. I think that's a motivation that you can get from other sources. I think the promise of transforming societies in the service of justice, equality, liberty, kind of old concepts of political modernity, I think itself can be something that motivates one to look at climate change beyond as a kind of technical problem of particular measures. And one can't obviously forget about those because they're part of how we identify the problem, but they can't be the limit of how we conceive it. And if religion, spirituality is brought into the mix, clearly it does create a kind of motivation which is not just utilitarian. It's not just about focusing on the things that you can put a number on, but the things that maybe you act for, even if you think of it as a lost cause, an improbable cause. I think that the politics of the unlikely is also something that we need to see more of in the present. The politics of simply picking things according to whether they are realistic, whether they are likely to work, and so on, is a kind of act of self-narrowing. So I think what's interesting about religion, but also, as you say, spirituality, perhaps also ideology in terms of a kind of a set of normative principles that one takes as commitments that one tries to maintain across time, all of them, I think, promise a kind of motivation which is more robust than one which is wholly empiricist, that is wholly about setting realistic targets and then checking whether we're moving closer towards them or away from them. I think one needs motivation that can tide us over the periods where the numbers are bad, and they will most often be bad, and you need to find ways of creating a kind of commitment to a cause that that finds resources beyond simply a kind of linear progression towards a target of some kind.
So implicit here is you're saying that we need to return to a politics of mass organisation, collective action, political parties, trade unions, etc., 19th century style of progressive politics.
There was a lot that was wrong with those forms of party-based ideological politics. They were clearly often very hierarchical. They were often quite exclusive in their membership. So I think parties would have to be done rather differently if they were to be something that one could really get behind as a desirable model of politics. I'm talking about kind of much more democratized parties in which membership is empowered rather than simply plays the role of knocking on doors once every 4 years, and a party that is dominated otherwise by its leadership. If a party is all about marginalizing the people that join it for its ideas and centralizing the people that join it for office and power, then it's not a particularly desirable way of doing things, and its ideological commitments are largely cosmetic. But it's true that I haven't, I think, seen a meaningful alternative to partisanship understood as a way of doing collective politics where people are genuinely committed to the ideas that a party defines itself by, and that they try to pair an effort to mobilize the public with an effort to gain control over the institutions of the state, which I think is the distinctive thing about party politics, that kind of bifocal focus on a public and on real institutional power, I haven't seen a workable alternative to exactly that model. And it seems to me that, one of the lessons of the last 10, 15 years is that occasionally you see moments of reversal, like the Corbyn period in this country, where you see that there is still a fair bit of enthusiasm for that kind of model when it actually seems like you can take it seriously, when there seems to be a party that sort of defines itself by a set of ideas, a program for change rather than simply competence, when it
Well, maybe
makes
when you could argue the SNP, right?
As well.
Mass membership, because this idea of an independent nation.
Sure. When you see these kind of moments of reversal that seem to be at odds with the longer story of change that every political scientist will tell you about, the decline of parties, the decline of ideology, the decline of representative democracy more generally, these moments of reversal suggest that there is, I think, quite a hunger out there for the capacity to join up to something, to try and be part of a project that is meaningful and that promises longer-term change rather than just managing the extremes of the moment. But of course, the likelihood of getting these things off the ground is as remote as ever in some ways. And the failure of the Corbyn experiment, I think, makes the next effort that much harder in this country, at least. But there's an enthusiasm that's still there, I think. So I certainly don't think one can afford to give up on the party model of doing politics, because I haven't yet seen the alternatives that, to my mind, offer that same combination of trying to speak to a public and trying to organise the state itself rather than trying to simply build opinion without speaking to policy itself.
So what do you think of things like Just Stop Oil? Because that's direct action social movements which aren't trying to get state power. They would openly say that. And they're not trying to create, majority consensus amongst the public, at least in the short to medium term. They're trying to disrupt people's opinions on things, right? But they're not aiming at those two things. Is that kind of activism, that kind of politics, do you think that's broadly a dead end? Is that kind of counterproductive?
I think it certainly can't be pursued on its own. I think if that becomes an alternative, if that becomes where people put their hopes of progressive politics, then yeah, I don't think that is an alternative to movements that try to become parties or shape parties, that try to speak to partisan power rather than around it. Of course, some of these movements, I think, are not even trying to speak to public opinion. So those that disrupt for the sake of changing prices, for kind of direct interventions in the cost of things, are, I think, not so much efforts to reach public opinion by a different means, but they are sort of efforts, kind of vanguardism of a different model. It's not my role to say that these are invalid models of how we should be doing politics in this time, but it seems to me that
it is. You've written a very good book about it all.
It seems to me that, firstly, efforts to try and do politics without public opinion are a kind of short-termism. So any meaningful change in politics, I think, has to involve persuading people along the way. And this is why, coming back to technocratic green transition stuff that we were talking about before, I don't think you can do meaningful policy transformations without taking a public with you. So insofar as some movements are indeed trying to mobilize public awareness, trying to get people to care about issues, yeah, that can be a valuable ingredient in a wider story of creating a movement. And then the question becomes, does that movement try to become a party, try to influence a party, try to internationally, try to link parties already existing in different countries and create a sort of internationalism, which I think is also crucial in the present. But I think if it becomes a substitute, I think if it becomes simply about awareness as though governments, institutions are going to listen to that newly aware public opinion, I think that's not likely to suffice. I think you do need that capacity to sort of locate those moments of mobilization within an enduring project like a party.
So, what do you think of Extinction Rebellion? Does a political movement like Extinction Rebellion, which isn't interested in taking power, like Just Paul, interested in taking power, not necessarily even at majority consensus, but definitely integrates to and amplifies the temporality of emergency, the politics of emergency. Do you think that those kind, and I think they do great work in many cases, many good people, but do you think that those kinds of movements can actually be the handmaids of fascism? Do you think they, not only can they not be effective, can they be counterproductive?
There is that risk. We drew that connection before, that if one emphasizes the stakes of the particular moment, the emergency, and as we said before, the promise of the after emergency, that this is something that plays to those who revel in that interlude of disruption, of chaos, and so on. I think certainly if XR is simply about declaring climate emergencies, I think that moment has probably passed now, and I think this is probably also acknowledged within the movement as well, that there is something about deadlines and emergency discourse that can be counterproductive. I think XR is it has its internal debates. It's not something that it speaks with one voice, and I think it's probably been in a learning process where it increasingly becomes aware of the limitations of deadlines, emergencies, a few years left as a way of thinking about the future in politics. Because if we don't go extinct, there is, of course, always that politics after the deadline. There's always the project that needs to be continued after the deadline that we miss or hit. So yeah, I think that's maybe had a valuable function to play in getting green politics on the agenda in the last 10 years. But I don't think it's a workable model, because it precisely front loads all the attention of politics into that critical moment and encourages a way of organization like the social movement, which is not about an organization intended to last. It's not about something which is organizing for the long term. It's about mobilizing for the short term. It's very hard to maintain that level of engagement. It's very hard to continue to keep pressure on institutions beyond the moment of initial mobilization if you organize in those terms. So I think, I think that cannot last as a way of organizing on the left generally and on specifically questions of climate and climate justice.
Yeah, it's intriguing because prior to a lot of this stuff, there was always this debate of, should we have extra parliamentary activism politics, or should you have more party-oriented stuff? And actually, it seems to me that when you had XR at the same time as a Corbyn-led Labour government, both helped one another. I mean, that's when, of course, the May government declares a climate emergency in this country. And the idea that you'd favour one or the other without the other, I think, is silly. Some people seem to think that actually it is zero sum and we shouldn't do this one and we should just do that one. But I think that's kind of been disproven.
I think that's right. I mean, sometimes when one talks about left strategy, it's almost as though the left can go one way or the other way. I think the very question of strategy kind of only makes sense when you're talking about an organisation and when you've got ways of determining policy and taking some decisions rather than others. But if we're talking about the left as a whole, as a wider constellation of ideas and interests, I don't think it makes sense to say it should be doing this rather than that. Its strategy should be to do extra parliamentary rather than parliamentary mobilization. No, it's not a train that goes one way or the other. It's something that people will try all these things, and it works best when they are, I think, trying them at the same time. I think it's not sufficient to focus on one at the expense of the other. You cannot say parliamentary politics on its own without the social movement is sufficient, and you really cannot, I think, say that social movement activism on the XR model without trying to tie that to party politics is going to work. It's only when the social movement speaks to the party, tries to become the party, is listened to by parties and so on. It's only when they're in some kind of symbiosis that I think you can hope for something meaningful to happen.
Jonathan, we're going to end it there. Your book is out in paperback. In the long run, the future is a political idea. Of course, modelled on that famous Keynes quote. It was a really fun book to read, really fun talking to you. And I have to say, the end notes are very comprehensive. So lots of reading material there too. Thanks for joining us on Downstream.
Thanks for having me, Alan.